Good day. Welcome to the third in the series of Historical Survey of Theology and Humor. We're going to finish up today on the Torah and then look at the Hebrew histories and the wisdom literature of the Jewish people. But first, the best joke in the world begins with a man passing by a tiny shop. But I get ahead of myself. Let me first say a couple things. I want to thank Bob Anderson for his brilliant technical help. What you may not realize is that my wife really wanted me to look mature and act with some gravitas. And so what Bob has done, he has used special effects to simulate a beard on my face. And if you notice in the first image that we're going to look at, it really sets as a model Charlton Heston, who played Moses. And so I am aspiring to kind of have this look. But we look at Moses, and in the next slide, we find that essentially, I do not have the power to part my soup like he parted the Red Sea, or as we saw Jim Carrey in Tom Shadyack's film, Bruce Almighty. But what these kinds of images give us is a sense of what is known as Quomodo. Basically, what is happening? How is this happening? There is a basic incongruity of life. And we find as well, there are many parodies of dividing the Red Sea and of Moses getting the Ten Commandments. So the next thing we look at is essentially extra textual jokes or humor and satire on Moses and receiving the Ten Commandments. And we begin to realize that humans slip into humor in many different ways. When Moses receives these two tablets from God on high, we also find that there are jokes about this. And so in the next slide, we see that God is saying from his burning bush, try this first. If they don't take these seriously, come back and I'll write them in stone or something. And so even balloons do not help. And it's as if Moses came back to God and said, they've broken all the commandments and they want to know if they can have some new ones. We have a tendency to sin, and the law comes down to us, and the law not only brings judgment, but it brings comedy. This also can be seen is when Moses has to tell the people, actually, they are written in stone. One of the great kind of comic moments on the Steve Colbert's Comedy Hour, is Comedy Report, is when he had a congressman, Lynn Westmoreland, who appeared. And Westmoreland wanted all of the United States to kind of post the Ten Commandments outside of courts. And so Stephen Colbert began to ask him, can you name the Ten Commandments? Unfortunately, he got to, well, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery. And so even this congressman could not name the Ten Commandments, and yet he wanted them posted. And at the end of the program, Colbert looked at him and said, I really want to thank you for coming on and breaking the fifth commandment of not honoring the Sabbath as we are shooting this program on the Lord's Day. Each of the commandments brings out something that has a bit of comedy into it. I think that the commandment on honor thy father and mother, it can be used as a stick on our children. However, even though we may think it's funny, they're going to disobey it anyway, as we disobeyed it with our parents. And so the commandments are there, and we recognize with the commandments that there is also the problem of sin. In fact, in one kind of comic scene, the Israelites asked Moses if they had to obey the commandment to not commit adultery if the woman was really hot. And Moses says, yes, even if she is really hot, you have to obey that commandment. And that shows us that Mel Brooks, next, when he played in his own film, History of the World Part 1, he brings down the commandments and he says, all pay heed. The Lord God Jehovah has given you 15, and then he drops one, 10 commandments for all to obey. Fortunately, we recognize that. One thing that is wonderful, though, that this film shows us, and others that are biblical films, is that there is this art of talking back to God. This is a wonderful kind of Hebrew habit that is so essential for anyone who seeks God, is this ability to give and take in a conversation with God. The comedy occurs as we ask God questions and we wait to hear his answers. We will see this come through, particularly with the story of Job and the conversations that he has in a while. So this idea of the comic midrash, of thinking about the text, of exploring the text, is something that comes through not only in films, but in cartoons and other media. Now, the next thing, we look back to one of the linguistic gags, and we've talked about kind of comic plots, comic functions, comic character types, but the puns that occur in scripture are rampant. They're everywhere. And in fact, regarding the plagues, one of the great puns of the Hebrew language connects the word for locust and the word for Arab as a simile. A locust, arbai, is like an Arab, arbai. And so Islamic tradition, we find there's also a story that locusts dropped into the hand of Muhammad. And on their wings was the inscription, "We are the army of the great God." And so a plague of locusts becomes kind of a double meaning in scripture as we see it. But next we find pronoun trouble. And this is going to be, we're looking at this kind of give and take between God and Moses. There is a subtle pronoun trouble. When God first calls Moses and he says, "Go tell Pharaoh, let my people go. Let my people go who have been held in bondage." And so later on, we find in Exodus that God changes his pronoun. And he tells Moses, after he sees them dealing in idolatry, "Go down at once, for your people, Moses, whom you brought up from the land of Egypt, have corrupted." Now, this leads us also to what we see as the problem of idolatry. You haven't, okay, let's go back. We didn't move. Also was there. Okay, I was here. Okay, are you ready, Bob, to go to the next one? Okay, here, okay. This leads us to the problem of idolatry with an old Chuck Jones cartoon. If you remember Chuck Jones in Rabbit Fire or Rabbit Duck, Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny have problems with pronouns, and Bugs is able to overcome him all the time with his use of pronouns. And so we see also in the divine idea that God is going to get upset with the people, with Moses' people. When Moses has gone up to Mount Sinai to receive the Ten Commandments, Aaron leads the children of Israel in constructing a golden calf and worshiping it and dancing around it in their own frenzy. What this leads to next is the sense of this hot potato of whose people really is this? Whose people are they? Now, we mentioned already that God had told Pharaoh through Aaron and Moses to let my people go. But the Lord switches this, telling Moses that the Israelite party basically are your people. But Moses quickly catches on to this kind of play, and he declines any kind of association with the Israelites. In fact, as far as Moses is concerned, these people are not his. This is the great joke. And respectively, he intercedes by throwing them back to God. "Oh Lord, why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand?" And then in a phrase that's been kind of erased from the original text, there's a phrase that's akin to "ha, ha, ha, ha" that Moses said, but we have kind of excused that from our modern translations. Next, though, is that we find that Aaron and the people try to excuse themselves. And this is very much like children and their parents, of saying, "No, we really didn't do it like this. There's something else involved in this." And as we see also, the little blue crayon talks to the green crayon parent and says, basically, the red crayon did it. When you see the evidence completely against us, it gets back to the origin of sin and say, we know we should act in certain ways, but we don't. And this is the nature of our sin with God, that we do not confess those sins that are there. So also we get back to this idea of the problem with Aaron telling Moses after having made the golden calf. He said, "What happened? They brought me their golden earrings. I simply threw them in the fire, and presto, out came this calf. I have no idea how it happened, honestly. And so this great satire that is placed in the book of Exodus is hilarious to realize that Aaron stands for all of us, of how we try to get out of the predicaments that we have put ourselves into. Now, next, we look back at all the laws, at Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and there is irony there. There is wisdom that comes through all of these laws. Particularly in Deuteronomy, we find that there are laws against eating bats. If we had only kind of taught this law of Leviticus to the people of Wuhan. There are other kind of proverbs too, that other laws that we find in Leviticus, where no matter what you tattoo upon yourself, if you tattoo one of the Levitical laws, there's still a law of saying don't put tattoos on your arm or on your body. And so we take up one law or the other, and we're under all of the law at first until we find that we are forgiven for our sin later on. If we look next at Mark Russell's Bible, he has a whole section on Deuteronomy. And in Deuteronomy, he basically says that Moses was given all these laws. And there are laws that protect us. There are laws for the good of the culture and the society. And yet, the people wonder, the laws are multiplying. And people wish that Moses would hurry and die because he's making up more and more laws. And he comes in with all of these new rules. And if you've ever worked in a university, you realize how easy it is for a bureaucracy to add new laws and new regulations and new policies. And we see that often in the government. But next, we look and then we have these kind of thoughts on the Exodus itself. When you're sitting in the pew and someone is reading the text from Leviticus or Exodus or Deuteronomy, and you begin to think of the children of Israel going through the wilderness, we see this juxtaposition of different ideas. When you're sitting through a lecture like this, you realize, when is my next rest area? And for us who are going through a pandemic or sitting through a lecture, the next rest area is a long time off. But even better is also the idea that Moses, after wandering for 39 years in the wilderness and 11 months, his wife decides finally to ask for directions. The comedy is, we men do not stop and ask for directions. And it took almost 40 years for Moses' wife, Zipporah, to say, okay, enough is enough. Let's stop and figure out where we are and where we need to get to the promised land. Now, the next story takes us to a comedy of reversal from the book of Numbers. And this is the story of Balaam and his ass and King Balak. King Balak of Moab knew that there was a good prophet, an effective prophet out there, who when he gave a curse, the word was as good as an action. This is called a devar, and we'll get to devar in just a second. But he wanted Balaam to come and to curse the Israelites who were beginning to invade his territory. So he hires him. He says, I'm going to give you a lot of money. Why don't you come? And as Balaam is traveling to this gig, suddenly in his path, his donkey stops. He becomes stubborn. He won't move. He beats him. He yells at him. But the donkey has seen an angel that Balaam cannot see. And so we see next that in this story, there is going to be a great satire, not only on prophets, but on all of us who do not see the donkey in the road of our lives. And so King Balak says, didn't I ask you to come urgently? I summoned you. Why didn't you come right when I wanted you to stop these Israelites? Next, we see that the prophet becomes so asinine because he is blinded by his own lack of vision. He is myopic to see that God may speak to him in different ways, even through an animal. And the next thing we see is that Balaam, when he finally recognizes that the angel is there, that the Lord removes the blinders from his eyes, he sees that the donkey is there, and the donkey has been obedient to God where he has not. And so he goes to King Balak and he breaks the contract, and instead of giving a curse upon the Israelite people, he gives a blessing. And the blessing is that they shall inhabit the land. Now, however, Balaam is actually a wicked man, a prophet, because he does confide in King Balak that if you want to really get to the Israelite people, all you need to do is entice them to commit sin of sexual immorality or to sacrifice to idols. And the Israelites, unfortunately, are going to fall into this trap, and God is going to send a deadly plague upon them. But Balaam, next we see that he had this donkey who tried to warn him. And Balaam's donkey always keeps talking to him. And so we find donkey even in Shrek. Say, we can stay up late, swapping manly stories in the morning. I'm making waffles. There's a sense in which we have donkeys in our life. And we also can see it, that if we look around, our donkey or our ass is saying something to us. What is your ass saying to you? Stop eating that. Get up off of me. Go do something. Go and forgive your neighbor. There are different things our donkeys are saying to us, and we need to listen to them. It is the great comedy of this story. The next story is kind of a pun, too, that we find about that, is that it translates much better to English than some of the others have. From the book of Judges, the writer describes 30 sons who rode around on 30 burros and lived in 30 burrows. So the pun becomes there. And I think the more we just read the Latin, the Greek, the Hebrew, the more we begin to kind of understand that these jokes are there. Now, 3 little stories that I'll tell that I think are kind of great comic moments in the books of the histories of the Israelites. First, from the book of Judges, we find a bit of slapstick, physical slapstick in this, where King Eglon of Moab was very fat. And you can almost hear Ed McMahon on the old Johnny Carson show saying, how fat was he? And Carson comes back and says, he's so fat that when Ehud, whose name means left-handed, comes in to assassinate him, his sword goes into his belly so far that the handle even sinks in. And so you've got this really kind of grotesque but hilarious moment where the sword goes into Eglon and the fat closes around him, and even, the writer tells us, his bowels discharged. Now, Ehud is a very bright, strategic assassin, and he escapes out the back door. And Eglon's servants are so afraid of him, they don't check, because they think that he is so fat, he might be out relieving himself. Additionally, the Hebrew root of Eglon means fatted calf. So he is this kind of sacrifice himself, but he is so stupid and so fat. How stupid and fat is he? He lets someone in that kills him. A second kind of grotesque bit of humor is when God sends a plague of tumors upon the Philistines, who have stolen the Ark of the Covenant. And what we see from the word is it is the word for hemorrhoids, possibly hemorrhoids or piles, that their suffering is going to be so horrendous until they give that back, until they make a trespass offering of 5 golden emerods or 5 golden mice. And so here we find that God brings this awful judgment on them for stealing what is holy. Oh, and the man who came to the tiny shop, he comes to this tiny shop on the road and he opens the door. But first, there's one other story. It's about the beautiful Abigail's rich old husband, Nabal. Nabal is a jerk. He insults David. He's churlish and evil, blunt in speech, rude, even boorish in his manners, even while Abigail is one of the most beautiful and gracious and brilliant women who knows how to handle David and will end up with David. But the servants of Nabal say he is such a son of a Belial, a devil, that a man cannot speak to him. He drinks too much wine. He falls asleep over his wine, his drinks. And so we look at his name, Nabal, and its etymology. And NBL basically appears in several expressions. It can mean a wineskin, because Nabal is a drunk. It can imply a corpse or a carcass, and he is going to die. And it can form a noun meaning foolishness. And so this really churly, stupid old man is going to live up to his name. Now, this gets us to a major idea, what is called the davar. It looks like dabar, but in Hebrew, the B has this V sound. Davar means a word that is an action. It is combining the two. If I said a blessing to you, the blessing would be as good as me giving you a treasure, a gift of money. If I had a curse to you, it would be the same as if I came and stabbed you in the stomach. And so the davar is the word and the deed coming together. It's not separate. Our word has this power of a deed. And so the word becomes a weapon of faith. It becomes a sword that can cut us spiritually. So we see next, even in the book of Genesis, there is this word indeed that when God speaks, it is davar. When God says, let there be light, it is as if there is light. The word light is an actual action. Next, we see that as well in kind of the little childhood thing that sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt me. Yes, words can hurt you because words have this same power of being like a stick and stone. It's something that attacks us. Next, in the ancient world, as Sir James Frazer told us, words had the power to kill or to hurt, and particularly satirical words. And so at the front of an army, you would send out your satirist. You would send out people who would throw words at the enemy to demoralize them. Now, at times you could send out your choir and they would sing, and their words would kind of inspire courage in your own troops. But at other times, you would let the satirist lead the soldiers into battle, where they would hurl satirical curses like spears and arrows. And we're going to find a very good biblical example of this soon. But next we see it in the old Crazy Cat in Ignatz the Mouse, where Crazy Cat would throw bricks. And words were these verbal bricks. And in the kind of silent animation of Crazy Cat and Ignatz the Mouse would throw these bricks kind of at Crazy Cat, with whom Crazy Cat's in love with Ignatz. But it's an abusive relationship. And these words were like bricks. This can also be seen where our tongue, as James tells us, is almost like a weapon. The tongue is this fire that can set a forest on fire. And we see the kind of the pain that comes out of our words. These words are deeds. When we speak evil to someone, we are cursing them. The next dabar of satiric words is like throwing verbal tomatoes, pies, or stones at the enemy, demoralizing them. And the great example of that in Scripture is this story of Goliath satirizing David. He will be the first Philistine to go out, and he will try to use demoralizing words, kind of slash his enemy even before he uses his sword. But the next thing to see is that in a comic plot like David and Goliath, you have the idea of the little overcoming the great. This idea of the lesser who is more powerful. And here you have Goliath, the giant, with the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him, and he comes closer and closer to David. He looks David over, and he saw that he was just little more than a boy, glowing with health, ruddy, handsome, and yet he despised him. So he said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine mocked David by his gods. Davar, his mocking and his words, he's throwing this out. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." But next we find that David responds to him. He begins to use davar as well. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you in my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistines' army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel." So the power of his word is the power of the actions that are going to come as well. We see this one last time next in how Goliath mocks David. In the ironic end, Goliath loses his head. And so this is the comic function of the biblical paradox that lifts the lesser over the greater. The humble is exalted. Okay, A little man is walking down a narrow street, and he opens the door to this tiny shop with many watches in the window. But first, this thought: God and the devil make a bet on Job. One of the great stories of the Bible is this story of how can a good man experience so much evil. And Satan comes to God and says, look, you've got a good man walking on this earth. You care to make a little bet about him. I think I can get this man to reject you, to kind of curse you. And so God says, no, he's a righteous man. Let's go ahead and try. So the next thing we find is that here we're going to have a comedy, but it starts as a tragedy. If comedy is tragedy plus time, look at your own life. Job is now one of the funniest books of the Bible. We're going to find in Job that God is going to reverse his fortunes, but first he has to take him down. So also this leads to the idea that a comic vision does not do away with suffering and tragedy. A comic vision is rooted in tears. It is rooted in the suffering of an individual. Things go wrong first before they can get better. And so the book of Job parallels the creation of Adam and Eve and their fall. We find a humiliation, a hopelessness, a suffering, but ultimately we find redemption occurring. This occurs really well in this story. So the comic vision of Job next starts with this tragic experience of him losing his children, of losing his livestock, of losing everything and receiving boils on himself. Even his wife says, why don't you just curse God and die? All of these kind of fake advisors, these friends come in and give him false advice. And so as we saw for Fry, the comic book is one that is best construed as a U-shaped narrative. It starts with what is wonderful, but it then takes us to the bottom, to the nadir of one's life before any redemption comes along. And so in the story of every man, like Job, we find that we're starting at the bottom. We start at the top and we move to the bottom, and tragedy comes before comedy. The next thing we find, however, is that while a tragedy will end in catastrophe, a comedy will end in what Tolkien called a eucatastrophe. EU means good. And so a good catastrophe is something amazing that is unexpected that happens at the end. We will see the same idea with the crucifixion and the resurrection. Something that looks like a catastrophe ends as a eucatastrophe, as something that is so amazing and so unbelievable that it takes us to a new level. And so as we find next in the images of William Blake, that we find in the book of Job, his counselors come along and they start by telling Job, how beleaguered he is, that basically the words of his mouth are like a mighty wind. And mighty wind here is the word pholus. Pholus means a fool, or it means a windbag. You're just kind of blowing gas. There's got to be sin in your life. There's got to be something wrong with your life. And so they give him all of this stuff, but they don't understand really what God's sovereignty is. But the sermon ends with this promise that God will yet fill your mouth with laughter and your lips with shouting. And this comes in the next image as well from Blake, where the blessing of God will come upon Job and his wife for his faithfulness, that God will yet fill your mouth with laughter. And it is one of the great promises of this awful book that looks like a tragedy, but will end as a comedy. In the next thing, we move to the wisdom literature, the rest of the wisdom literature. And in the book of Psalms, the first two Psalms give us a hint of what we are not to be, and yet what God may be doing as well. The first thing it does in Psalms 1, it tells us not to walk in the way of sinners, nor stand in the way of the ungodly, nor to sit in the seat of scoffers. To sit in the seat of scoffers is to become a little too comfortable in your sarcasm. And some of us are in danger of that. But Psalm 2 comes along and tells us that God himself is enthroned in the heavens and looks down and mocks the people who think they are something. He mocks the scoffers and the mockers. And so some of us are in danger. But I like to tell my wife that essentially I try to be like God. And if God is a mocker, I'm going to try to be a good mocker. But she responds that when you're as good and just as God, then you can be like God in that way. So I must pull back and watch my tongue that is there. But we find next that in the Psalms, the Lord does laugh at those because he sees the wicked's day coming. Here you find even the great Hulk is dealing with this false god Loki, and he can just take him and show him that he is not the God. Psalm 59 tells us as well that God laughs at the nations. The nations think that they are independent, that they do not need him, but God says, yes, you do. The other kind of laughter that we also find in the Psalms is the laughter of joy. And the laughter of joy is a laughter of thanksgiving and reunion. It's a laughter that is very positive. We've seen a lot of negative laughter, and we're going to see more next week with the prophets, this kind of satiric laughter against sin. But there is this wonderful, gracious, hearty, hilarious, holy laughter that comes in singing to the Lord. In fact, shouts of joy and music are connected with hilarity, connected with laughter. We can see this next, even when we make hymns to the Lord. We're called to make a joyful noise unto the Lord. And even if it's only a yippee every now and then, it is something. The more we practice this kind of praise and joy and laughter, the more we ourselves will be filled with the Holy Spirit and laughter, something that is good and holy. Now, the next thing we see is that thanksgiving itself, giving thanks, is a kind of laughter. When we thank God, when we thank one another, we find that we begin to laugh for no reason other than the incongruity that what we expected we did not receive, and what we did not expect we did receive. And so we can be thankful for things that come our way. And one way of being thankful is to laugh with the glory of gratitude. Laughter of thanksgiving and joy that comes next comes also in the idea that we are going to go home, that we are not going to be stuck in the tragedy and the valleys of our life. We're not going to be stuck in the office of our life, but we can go home. This happens next as well in the idea of reunions, where reunions are a foretaste of heaven. When we think of those whom we've loved, who have gone on before us, who have died and moved on to be with the Lord, there's a sense of loss and need. But whenever we are reunited with a person, we begin to realize that we are going to laugh. Think of what it is like when you see someone unexpectedly at a shopping mall or an airport or somewhere where you don't expect to see them. And what do? Often the first thing you'll do is you'll laugh. And you'll laugh and go over and see them and just embrace them. Because this is something you didn't expect. But this reunion out of nowhere is a wonderful celebration of being brought back together. And so there are people from whom we have been divided, people from whom we've been separated, that when we see them again, we will laugh. And when children see their fathers coming home from service, there is a delight, there is a laughter, there is a gasp, and there is such joy that is there. The Psalms next say that our mouths are filled with laughter and our tongues with shout of joy. There is no greater comedy than to see this in the Psalms. And when we are hurting, it is the place to go in the Psalms and to receive this kind of laughter. Now, next, Mark Russell again kind of created the Psalms, and he shows that as a musician, probably one of the greatest kind of harp players of all the time, that David had his own kind of top hits. Some of them we know were "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." But we don't often sing "The Tents of Kedar are going to be rocking tonight." But we look at David, and David wrote all of these Psalms, many of them starting with suffering, many of them starting with questions. But he moves into Psalms of praise. However, next we find that one of my old friends, John Lawing, really kind of captured what David may have felt with after kind of a night of a lot of celebration. When he gets up and he looks in the mirror and he said, "Thou makest the outgoings of the morning to shout for joy." Did I really write that? There are times we wonder what the Psalms are about in our own lives, but we did. And yet, Monday morning comes along. Next, we find, however, there's kind of a good old Jewish joke where David Schwartz writes of picking up a Gideon Bible in a hotel room, and he's looking for guidance. And in it, there's a little piece of paper that said, if you're sick, read Psalm 18. If troubled, read Psalm 45. If you are lonely, read Psalm 92. So he said, I was lonely, so I opened to Psalm 92 and I read it. But when I got through reading it, I noticed a handwritten line scribbled on the bottom of the page. It said, if you are still lonely, call Hollywood 5069 and ask for Ida. The Psalms can help almost any need. Next, however, though, we move to the book of Proverbs, that Solomon, after David kind of wrote his Psalms, we find that Solomon writes a lot. And he writes about how a merry heart makes for a cheerful countenance, or it makes your face happy. One of the areas of research that I have gone into is to reverse that kind of question, make it a spiritual palindrome, essentially. Kind of, can a cheerful countenance, what you put on your face, make a merry heart? Can we turn this around, that if we smile at people, if we show a grin, and we show mirth and merriment on our face, can that affect our heart? And there have been many nonverbal studies by Paul Ekman and others who have demonstrated that what we put on our face, we begin to experience. And so by the end of these lectures, at the end, you've got to go through a lot of suffering and tragedy and 40 years in the wilderness of lecture until we get to a place where we're going to actually practice laughter. And we're going to practice putting this kind of mirth upon your faces to see if that begins to change your heart. But until then, we've got to go through a lot of academic journeys. The next thing, however, is we come to Solomon. And Solomon is quite a character himself. He had his problems, but as he wrote different books, he wrote the Proverbs. He collected Proverbs from so many different sources, from Babylon, from Egypt, and brought them all together. Probably the Queen of Sheba brought a couple for him to include. If he's on Jeopardy, of course, Solomon, as the wisest man of the world, is going to win that is there. And Solomon goes on and he writes these books. The next one, we find a couple kind of stories that deal with his wisdom. For example, there were two women in a bus were fighting Beverly over the last seat available. And the conductor already tried to intervene, but didn't work. So the driver shouts, "Let the ugly one take the seat." Both women stood for the rest of the journey. Or the old joke about two women who run into the court of King Solomon fighting, saying, "My daughter was to marry this man, but this woman claims this man was to marry her daughter." And so the king says, there's a simple solution. "I shall cut the man in half, and each of your daughters shall have a piece." "Fine by me," says the first woman. "No, don't. I would rather let the other girl marry him than that," cried the second. The king didn't hesitate for a minute. "Fine," he said. "The first woman shall have him." "What?" protested the other. "She wanted him cut in pieces." "Indeed," said the king, "she shows the true spirit of a mother-in-law." It's a different take on the whole parable, but Solomon has his wisdom still of how he deals with all of these predicaments. However, we see there's a wonderful old poem that is next, where King David and King Solomon led merry, merry lives with many, many lady friends and many, many wives. But when old age crept over them with many, many qualms, King Solomon wrote the Proverbs and King David wrote the Psalms. There is a sense when you get older in life that you're going to look back and there's some things you regret, but you have another opportunity to do a redaction. You have an opportunity to write Psalms and Proverbs. And next, we find in the kind of book of Proverbs, there is wit. And there is quite a bit of wit. There are warning to fools all over the place. Silence, writes King Solomon, is better for the wise and even wiser for the fool. All of these proverbs are there to teach a young man what is stupid and what is not stupid. And we remember Mr. T saying, I pity the fool, I pity the fool. And yet all of us are the fool as we look at it. The next thing shows us a proverb that my wife kind of often tells to me, that as the man who throws fiery darts, so is the fool that says, was I not joking? One of my students once did a film on a husband and wife. And anytime the husband would mock the wife or make fun of her, suddenly she was hit with an arrow. And the arrow would start hitting her. And so soon she was all covered with arrows, these words, these dabar that came out. And so we were at an evening party, my wife and I said something that I thought was quite witty and quite a jest, but it was at her expense. And she goes, the arrow had hit her. And so from now on, we have this kind of ongoing joke that whenever my tongue gets out of control, I'm shooting these arrows. And I might say, was I not joking? But I am like a man who throws these fiery darts. It is not right, it is not good, and it has its consequences, I can tell you. There is quite a bit of wisdom and wit about women in there. Proverbs 31, as you may know, ends with this image of the ideal woman who can make her own clothes, who deals in real estate, who is a great financier, who handles all kinds of things, while her husband sits in the gate and talks to his friends that is there. And it ends with this idea that a good wife can smile at the future. She can laugh at days to come. However, there are other proverbs in the book that warn it is better to dwell in the house of a corner of a housetop than with a brawling or a nagging woman in a wide house. It is interesting that at the beginning of Psalm 31, this Proverb 31, the Proverbs about all the good women, the ideal wife, there's a little bit about a husband who is married to the ideal wife. And it says about him, let him whose life is miserable, because he's married to the ideal wife, drink strong drink, and let him forget his troubles. Not really, but it is a wonderful kind of juxtaposition of a man who's told to drink and his wife who is perfect. But we move on very quickly. The old joke, to order a Christian husband, click submit. Now that may be a joke for husbands, but the next one is for women, where God promised men that good and obedient wives would be found in all corners of the world. Then he made the earth round, and he laughed, and he laughed, and he laughed, and he laughed. Some of the Proverbs deal with the 7 deadly sins, and one in particular is sloth. Sloth and the sluggard are there. The sluggard said, oh, there's a lion in the road. I can't go outside. It's in the open square. I've got to stay in my bed. Or even as a door turns on its hinges, so the sluggard kind of turns on his bed. He is so lazy. How lazy is he? He is so lazy, he buries his hand in this food, and he's too tired to bring the food to his mouth. The sluggard is so lazy that we see him through Scripture. And who's ever had a teenage son who likes to eat has recognized the wisdom of this proverb. Peanuts by Charles Schulz next kind of gets this as well. When Charlie Brown comes up and he says to Snoopy, for your edification, I am reading from the book of Proverbs, 6th chapter, 9th verse. How long, you loafer, will you lie there? How long until you rise from your sleep? Snoopy takes the book of Proverbs and he goes through it and he hands it back to Charlie Brown. Chapter 12, verse 10. A good man cares if his beast is hungry. So Charlie goes back to have his breakfast and says, I forgot that he used to teach Sunday school at the Daisy Hill Puppy Farm. In other words, there are proverbs that can indict all of us. There is a proverb that can shoot an arrow in each one of us. The next book that Solomon wrote, after having all of this wisdom, was when he got to later in life and he became somewhat of a cynic. He became despairing of human nature, looking at what he had become and how his boys were going to divide up his kingdom and how many wives he had. And so he looks and he wonders about laughter. Is it just madness? Does it really accomplish anything? And we see next in his book that he has talked, as we mentioned last time, that there is a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to tear a cloth and a time to mend it, a time to be silent, a time to speak, a time to mourn and a time to dance, and then a time to weep and a time to laugh. In Ecclesiastes, it is his time to weep. Mostly what we find in there is that he has grown weary of life and despaired. In fact, he's very, very similar. Next, we see to all the vanity of life is there, the futility of life. All of that is there. He looks around and everything looks like a vexation of spirit that is there. But he's very much like the next person we would encounter, and that's Woody Allen. Woody Allen, if you read any book of the Bible, it would have been Ecclesiastes. He tells Diane Keaton in Annie Hall, his great movie, I have a very pessimistic view of life. I feel that life is divided up into the horrible and the miserable. Or also, he says, well, that's essentially how I feel about life, full of loneliness and misery and suffering and unhappiness. And it's all over much too quickly. It's like the women at this Catskill restaurant. The food here is terrible, and there's so little of it. Solomon, like Woody Allen, has these anxieties. He has these worries. He has these despairs. But we see for him next that it is all kind of a chasing after wind. That everything he has done to build up Israel, to build the temple, to gather all of this wealth and power is just like chasing after wind. And it's futile. It seems that you cannot control your life, and we cannot. So that is there for Solomon. And even in the next images, we find that a man trying to stand against the wind, it is futility. Or a dog chasing something in the wind, that is our lives, going day in and day out. But I must mention that next, that is not the end of life. Because even in this book of despair and futility, Solomon recognizes that there is in community, there is in fellowship, this laughter that is there, that bread is made for laughter and wine will gladden your life. And this is not only true physically and socially, that when we get together and we eat and we break bread with one another and we drink wine with one another, but this is also a symbol spiritually of what happens when we encounter the living bread. And in the living bread, we find this life. Now, if we open up the last book that he wrote, it is the Song of Solomon. No, this is probably an earlier book before Ecclesiastes. It's after he writes this book that he gets to Ecclesiastes. But the Song of Solomon is this wonderful kind of erotic book that we look at next. And there is a wonderful kind of literal illustration of the Song of Solomon. How beautiful you are, my darling. How beautiful you are. Your eyes are like doves behind your veil. And we see two little doves that are there. Your hair is like a flock of goats. Your teeth are like a flock of newly shorn ewes or lambs. Your lips are like a scarlet thread. Your temples are like a slice of pomegranate. Your neck is like a tower of David built with rows of stones on which are hung 1,000 shields. Your two breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle, which feed among the lilies. Your lips, my bride, drip honey. Honey and milk are under your tongue. Your nose is like the tower of Lebanon. I'm not sure if that's one of the great compliments, but it must be. Whose faces towards Damascus. And we continue on a little more. Your lips, my bride, as we said, drips honey. Honey and milk are under your tongue. That's the promised land. Remember, where there is milk and honey, and all the fragrance of your garments is like the fragrance of Lebanon. Your navel is like a round goblet. Your belly is like a heap of wheat, and your breasts are like clusters of grapes. I will climb the tree. Song of Solomon goes on, and it's really wonderful. If you look at it kind of literally like this, it's very funny, but you realize that there are meanings behind every phrase. For example, when Solomon says that your teeth are like rows of lambs, it means that there are matching pairs. Before any kind of orthodontal care, this woman had all of her teeth and they were as white as these little lambs. And so there are symbols behind the words, but if you try to take it literally, you'll get this monstrosity. We look at how this next may work if you're trying to kind of date a woman, when you tell her hair is like a flock of goats. And it's soft, but it is not quite always received as a compliment. Or if you find next all these kind of Valentine candies and you say, hey, tower neck, or your breasts are equal to fawns, your teeth are sheep, you got goat hair. Not quite the romantic images you want, unless you are Hebrew living in Solomon's days. But we end up next with Solomon, who did marry 700 wives and had 300 concubines. But as if that wasn't enough, next we find that even though he was the wisest man in the world, he couldn't figure out a solution for having 700 mothers-in-law. Probably why he wrote Ecclesiastes. And even then, none of his wives understood him. Okay, finally, next. Walking down a narrow lane, a little man notices a tiny shop where the window is crammed with wristwatches. Needing a new watch, he enters and he asks to buy one. The kindly shopkeeper, an elderly Jewish man wearing a beard and a skull cap, apologizes. Sonny, I'm sorry. We sell no watches here. Then what do you do? Asks the confused customer. I'm a mohel, the old fellow replies. A rabbi what performs ritual circumcisions. Even more puzzled, the visitor shakes his head and asks why he has so many watches in his window. The rabbi shrugs. So, what would you put in the window? And so, this is our question. What would we put in the scriptures? What do we see in the scriptures? We see a lot of solemnity, but there is comedy. And the comedy is there for us to see, from the Torah, through the histories, through the wisdom literature. Now, next week, we get to the Hebrew prophets. And the Hebrew prophets are going to give us a different kind of laughter, a satiric laughter, which really parallels the satire of Horace and Juvenal, the Roman satirists who are looking at the corruption of their age. And they're going to be tough, and it is going to be biting laughter. And they're even going to say, was I not joking? No, I'm telling the truth. We will see you next week. Thank you.